Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our Lown webinar series. I'm Allison Kelly Hedgepath, joined by Dr. Dara Lee Lewis, and we welcome everybody back again. Today, we're joined by Erin Murray, who is a nutrition expert. She not only works directly with patients, but does training for healthcare professionals, and I have enjoyed sharing some patients with Erin over the past few years. So it is such a treat, Erin, for you to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. So happy to be here. Awesome. Should I go ahead and share?
That would be great. We are excited about hearing some pearls of wisdom as we start 2022 about
Perfect.
reframing nutrition. I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, and hello, everybody. So today my workshop is titled Reframing Nutrition. This is a topic that I'm so passionate about because I find that having the proper framework for a part of our health or for anything, any data point is essential to being able to solve a problem or see it clearly. And nutrition is a really interesting part of our lives here in the US and in our health lives and in our daily life that for many people can pose an array of hurdles. So framing that properly so that we can see what we really need to do with it, so that we can see what's really going on, is essential. So we're going to get into that today. First, I just like to introduce myself just so you know who the nutrition lady is, who's always yapping up here doing things. I teach a lot, so I like to make sure that people just know who I am before we get started. So my name is Erin Murray. I have a master's of science in nutrition with a focus in research, as well as my didactic program in dietetics. Many hours of clinical fieldwork, so some of my time is spent in a hospital setting, but a lot of my time is spent as a research assistant, as well as a private practice nutrition coach for a lot of habit change, behavior change, and a lot of a lifestyle focus in my personal private practice setting. And I also am the founder of a course called Nourish, where we teach other clinicians habit change and behavior change science so that we can help our clients and patients much better and much more deeply. And that is a passion of mine because I have coached thousands of people over the past decade. And whether I'm teaching or coaching one-on-one, I've worked with all sorts of people. And many failures are really the impetus for the work that I have now. When I started coaching people a decade ago, I wasn't doing so well with them. And nutrition was so fascinating to me because everybody wanted to do something with their nutrition and they struggled to do it. And I found it troublesome, but ultimately very curious and fascinating that people wanted something so deeply and then often couldn't get it. And that became an area of interest of mine because I wondered, why? What are these hurdles? Why does this happen to most of us? You can really only sit in so many one-on-one sessions. And as a student where I was shadowing and I saw it everywhere, you can only see it so many times before you wonder what's happening. Because what I saw all the time was a client coming in or a patient coming in and saying, I didn't do the homework. And the clinician or the coach might say, okay, well, do you think you can do it this week? And the client says, I'll try. And then they leave and they come back and they say, I didn't do the homework. And you can't see that so many times before you start to wonder what's going on here. So I share that and my time spent in all these failures. I was not a great coach at the beginning because I was doing what I thought was the right nutrition model. I thought I had the right framework. And after so many shortcomings and feeling like I wasn't serving my clients well, I had to build a new framework. And that brings us into a different part of our science. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So although I can't see you all, I love to first think of what is it that comes to mind when we think of nutrition? Often when I'm teaching, I'm in person or can see lots of faces, but maybe just to yourself, start thinking about what is it that I think of when I think of nutrition? Often answers to this question include things like meal plans, meal prep, vegetables, healthy eating, diets, fast food, cooking at home, all sorts of things can come up here. Maybe we do shake replacements for meals. Maybe we're fasting. Lots of products might come up, lots of ideas that we've heard of before. Calorie counting. Maybe we've done a bunch of different strategies ourselves to deal with nutrition. For some people, the word disappointment comes up a lot, or feeling like a failure, or feeling like I just can't figure it out. That comes up a lot in nutrition as well. So I like to go way back because my brain likes to investigate things. So my first thought as I started down this road of why I felt I might not have the right framework for nutrition was to investigate where nutrition even came from. And I love this little image. This is a more colonial antique image of scurvy. And you may have heard of scurvy. This is an ailment that can arise when a human being is deficient in vitamin C. And this is what we call a disease of deficiency. So sailors infamously used to get this when they were traveling the globe. English sailors were actually often called limeys because captains figured out, have everybody chew on a lime occasionally, and they don't seem to get this issue of scurvy. So interestingly, I love the criteria. Have you got scurvy? You have sore gums, your stomach rumbles, your feet are itching, your sea legs are no longer. My favorite is you are cranky, people do not like you. If you have scurvy, please leave the ship. We eventually came to understand that scurvy was a non-communicable disease. I couldn't pass vitamin C deficiency to a fellow sailor. But interestingly, this is really where nutrition science began. We've been fascinated with food for thousands of years. Even the ancient Greeks like Socrates spoke about nutrition and physical fitness and health. It's definitely been on our minds, and we've known and been aware that something deep is going on with our food and our behavior. But nutrition as a formal science didn't emerge until the early 1900s. In fact, we didn't isolate vitamin C until about 1926. And thereafter, there was a sequence of years and really decades where we were isolating the vitamins. We were discovering them, discovering that vitamin C prevented scurvy, or that vitamin B1 prevented beriberi, and so on and so forth. So this really all originated with what we call these diseases of deficiencies. And interestingly, these diseases of deficiency are also, to a degree, single nutrient interactions. So I can cure or prevent scurvy with vitamin C. Vitamin C, scurvy. So nutrition was really born in this single nutrient interaction framework. And then really interestingly, this is where then the science started being born, but also interacting with the public. So by 1941, we're leaving the Great Depression and about to enter World War II. And most vitamins and minerals have been isolated by this time. And we actually get the first set of recommended daily intakes from the National Nutrition Conference on Defense. So what precipitated this is that we often don't think of this now because we don't see it as much. But during the Great Depression, the United States and many of its citizens were faced with diseases of deficiency. These were real. They were very much in daily life. People were suffering from them. There was missing nutrients in their diet all the way to the point of a pathology arose. We might not see that as much now. We see that less commonly, particularly in the New England area. We maybe some vitamin D issues, but we don't see those as much, right? Hopefully you don't know someone with scurvy, although it does happen in parts of the world. But nonetheless, our government became very concerned about our national defense, because when you have a population that has deficiency diseases, they are unfit for war. So as we left the Great Depression and shifted into World War I, we actually get the first set of dietary recommendations, but it was from the National Nutrition Conference on Defense. And it offered guidelines so that we met certain caloric loads, as well as certain nutrients like protein, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and a few vitamins. And all of these recommendations were aimed at preventing deficiency diseases. So it was very much about getting enough, getting certain things in so that we didn't see things in our warfighting population like scurvy. Interestingly, though, by the 1950s, post-World War II, we see a decline in these diseases of deficiency. And then we start getting some other health issues in this country. And then by the 70s, we started having research into fat versus sugar and how they related to non-communicable diseases, or what we often call metabolic diseases. So we started looking at, is fat causing these diseases or is sugars causing these diseases? So we really had the same mindset of, we want to find the thing that causes the disease, because that was the operating framework for all of nutrition thus far at this time. By 1977, we see the US Senate Committee report, Dietary Goals for the United States, which recommended low-fat, low-cholesterol diets for all. And these were the first dietary recommendations from the United States government. This was still not national dietary guidelines. It was just a committee report. So by the late 70s, we get this first report on what we want all Americans to be eating. And in mind, we have these metabolic diseases that we're starting to notice. But by 1980, the United States National Academy of Sciences Food and Nutrition Board reviewed that data and concluded that insufficient evidence existed to limit total fat, saturated fat, and dietary cholesterol across the population. For all of us here, this is nothing new. This is nutrition drama, as I call it. We hear all these different voices saying different things in our nutrition culture here in the United States. This was one of the first big moments of that. So for individuals who had heard just a few years prior this Senate report, maybe they were paying attention to it, they were getting aware of these diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes that we were starting to hear about. Then they hear, well, wait a minute, actually, we don't think there's enough evidence for that. So here we have Americans beginning to say, well, what am I supposed to eat? Then in 1980, the USDA issued their formal Nutrition in Your Health dietary guidelines for Americans. And you probably know dietary guidelines well. These are the set of dietary guidelines that you've seen before. They get updated every 5 years. You're familiar with this type of communication. 1980 was the first set of these. And they described 7 principles for a healthful diet to help people make healthy food choices daily, and they were particularly in regard to heart disease. Interestingly, though, this is where my brain says this is where something interesting is going on. These guidelines were the first formal guidelines recommending limiting certain foods, when just in 1941, we were telling people how to get enough. That says a lot about what happened in our food culture, right? That's just a few decades. That is not a long time. That's just a few years, really. Many people were alive for both set of recommendations. In the 1940s, we're so worried about these deficiency diseases, we're focused on getting enough. And by 1980, we're worried about getting too much. That says a lot about what our food lives were becoming and the dramatic transformation that we had undergone in this country. But really interestingly, we were very focused with a similar mindset of how to approach nutrition. And I'm stopping that thread for a minute because I want to show you what was going on at the same time. So in the United States, we have some really nice surveillance systems that help us get data, ongoing data on the population. One of these is called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And these began when we were trying to detect dietary patterns, risk factors, really what people are eating, what they're doing, how they're living. And we try to collect snapshots of this data all over the United States at any given moment. In 1985, we began looking for risk factors for these non-communicable diseases that we were getting so worried about. We were noticing that their prevalence was really increasing. So we started tracking it. And in 1985, what we used as kind of a proxy for this risk assessment was something called BMI, which you've probably heard of. And this, I'm thinking of this very much in relation to, we have these dietary recommendations now. We saw some different voices in the nutrition world debating them a little bit, but nonetheless, we have these dietary guidelines. So that's the formal side of things. This is the formal communication. This is the scientists talking and debating as they should. But what was going on in the US at that time, where we went from being worried about getting enough to being worried about getting too much? And these maps, I think, share a lot of information about what was going on in the United States. So this darker blue color is where we see 10 to 14% of the adult population having a BMI of 30 or more. And we just started tracking these through the years. And you can see by 1987, there's more dark blue, and there's more light blue working through the country as well. Same in 1988. The prevalence of this is increasing. More dark blue, more dark blue. Now we have a new color. In these navy blue states, 15 to 19% of the adult population has a BMI of 30 or greater. The blue just keeps spreading. You can see the rhythm to this map. Every year, these darker colors are expanding, and then we need a new color. By 1997, we have states with over 20% of the adult population has a BMI of 30 or more. Continuously, you see this spreading. And this is what's going on in the country at this time. This is why I like these maps. I love a good visual aid. By 2002, we have a new color. Over 25% of the population has an increased risk factor. And you can see these increasing. By 2005, over 30% of the populations. And this continues to spread. So what happens in 2011 is the researchers conducting the behavioral risk surveillance ends up saying this data is moving rapidly. Maybe we're collecting data improperly, because at the time they were only collecting data via landlines. And I always say we have to pay it forward to research. If anyone from a study ever calls, this is my plug for them, and they ask you what you eat, just please help science and get an answer. Bear with them for a few minutes just so they can get the data. But they were only calling landlines at the time. And they said, let's also call cell phones and see if that shifts the nature of our data, because this increase in prevalence is happening so rapidly that perhaps we have a bias in our sample. So they include cell phones. And then what they found was the data actually didn't change. It continued to increase. Similar pattern to the statistics in 2011, and then again in 2012. And then we have again a new color in 2013. And this continues all the way to another new color, and we see these spreading. And I'll stop here at 2015, just because you can imagine the way that the map continues. And here's what my brain says. This is what's going on in the population. This is what we're talking about in science. Here's how we're communicating. Is this type of communication helping people? Are we helping people get healthier? Are we reducing risk? This reminds me very much of me in my office at the beginning of my career. I'm just wondering, what am I doing wrong? This isn't working. I'm not seeing the shift that I need to help people achieve. And what I think really feeds into this issue is that nutrition as a science often has glasses on that are biased towards a single nutrient interaction. And I'm going to take this farther. We're going to leave nutrition science, nutrition research on the shelf, because now what we really more so are dealing with in our daily lives is the wellness industry. Most of us learn things about food, or what we should be eating, or what we want to eat, or different strategies for eating, more so through these channels of the modern wellness industry. This is often also called diet culture. And this mindset is the single nutrient mindset, which I think is due to nutritional science origin, which is I can cure scurvy with vitamin C. That was what all of our initial research was on in food science. And now we see this continuing. We wanted to look at metabolic diseases and think, what's the one thing I got to get rid of? Is it fat or is it sugar? And then we're doing this now with really complex issues like gut health. I'm sure you've heard of the microbiome and gut health or leaky gut. And what is everybody saying? They're saying, what probiotic should I take? And then for weight loss, what do we see in the wellness industry? Cut out this, cut out that, or just replace this, take this supplement. And then even more importantly, when we look at long-term health, can we bring that single nutrient model into that question? And when we look at food behavior and the way we eat and how we live in total, I think it's not a single nutrient interaction. It looks a lot more like this. It's an endless stream of relationships. And I often say to my clients, when I'm looking at you, I'm not looking at single nutrient interaction, cause and effect. I'm looking at a constellation of stars when I'm looking at you. Everything that you've been through in your life, what your day looks like, how you learn to eat, how you learn to interact with food and talk about your body, how you learn to cook and understand food, how you feel at your dinner table, how you feel at your job. All of these things are streams that feed the river, which is your nutritional intake in totality and the totality of your health. That is a river fed by many streams. So when we just try to cut one thing out or replace a meal with a shake or give someone a quick pill, I know we all wish there was a good diet pill. Unfortunately, there still is not one out there. We are still bringing to the table that single nutrient mindset. And what I want to offer you today with Reframing Nutrition is to give you a new model, because I fully believe that when we look at a picture, if we are looking at it very almost low resolution and the picture is all grainy, we can't really see it, right? When I look at food behavior and our nutrition, I want a high resolution image where I can see everything that I need to see. And I try to approach my clients with that mindset and anyone that I'm looking to help, even myself. I don't want a fuzzy, low resolution image. I want to see clearly. And we need the right framework for that. We really need to have the right glasses on. And this brings us to this interesting interaction that we have in our food life, which is that we have the wellness industry and then our food culture in this country. And as I mentioned, remember how much our food culture shifted between 1941, where we're worried about getting enough, and 1980, where we're worried about getting too much. Something really dramatic happened in there. And I think in that time frame, it gave rise to what we call the American paradox, which is a notably unhealthy society obsessed with the idea of being healthy. And there's a lot of ideas, but there's not always a lot of tools. And there's not this high resolution image to understand you and the way you eat and the way you interact with your food more deeply. And in that depth, there's a lot of answers. Thankfully, they're there. But we first just need to look at what does go into our food life then. So I like to think a lot about our food culture. You've probably already heard me mention the term. That's a term I use for the culture that we're in surrounding food here in this country, at least. We definitely have national food culture. We also have regional food cultures, and we very much also have a food culture at home. It's not unusual for me to have a client who might have grandparents or parents who came from another country, and the way they interacted with food was dramatically different than the way they saw their friends' families interacting with food. I have a client whose grandmother was from Italy, for example, and a big part of her childhood was making fresh pasta with her grandmother. And then if she went to a friend's house, no one would ever make fresh pasta next door. So just even that alone is a difference in food culture. So we can think about these different layers to the food culture that we are in and how we learned about food. So here in the US, kind of the signature of our food culture is that there isn't really one. There's productization. We know that for sure, right? Lots of food products, our grocery store shelves are filled with them. But we also have productization of health foods and diet foods as well, right? Lots of products. And there's also countless feeding opportunities, which there's a lot of science to that as well, which I have to restrain myself today, so I won't go down that road. But that we know for sure that when human beings see and smell food, all of our olfactory senses then cue the brain to crave the food that is giving the olfaction those volatile compounds. So in English, that all that means basically is if I see a donut and smell a donut, I maybe didn't want a donut 2 minutes ago, but now all of a sudden I really want a donut. And our physiology literally works that way. And there's a lot of interesting processes inside of that, but nonetheless, they're definitely there. So when we see food all the time and we are cued to eat, it definitely promotes more eating. And that is, we are steeped in that in this food culture here. We also have to-go culture. One of the most interesting things was I went to Brazil last year for my brother's wedding. He married a woman from Brazil, so my sister-in-law, and I noticed it right away that any shop you went into, so I'm a coffee lover, so one of the first places I went was into a coffee shop. You couldn't get a coffee in a to-go cup. The cafes don't even own them. They're not even in the store. You always get a little ceramic dish with a saucer under it, and you are expected to sit, sip your coffee, and then carry on with your day. And I noticed that even in their cars, nobody ate in their cars. You didn't even see it on the road when you were passing people. There was nothing that was to go. And I asked one of her family members about it. I was, of course, being nosy, noticing all the food. And her family member, her brother-in-law, said to me, a Brazilian person won't eat something unless it needs a fork and a knife. It's not good if it doesn't need a fork and a knife. And I thought that was so funny, so interesting. And that's their norm. Our norm is to-go culture. I even saw a commercial, I'll never forget it. I think it was about a year ago. There was these types of cookies, it was one of the Chips Ahoy brands, and it came in this container. And the advertisement in the TV commercial was that you could put the cookie container in your cup holder in your car. And then there was a mom driving her kids to soccer, pouring cookies into her mouth from the to-go cup. And that was like the thing, it was to-go cookies. And I thought, this is so interesting. We're even queuing food and then putting it in packages so that we'll keep it with us at all times and bring it with us. These are really things that alter the way we perceive and interact with food when we grow up learning things like that and seeing things like that. So the food is fast, the food is to go, the food is everywhere. And then we have this really interesting layer of diets. All these diets with different names, different strategies, different rules. Many of them also have products and recipes and cookbooks that go with them and even supplements. So the way I think of it when I think of my clients, there's all this food and then we're kind of told not to eat it, but it's everywhere. And then we're trying to stick to this diet, but everyone at our dinner table is eating pizza and we have our frozen, whatever it is, South Beach dinner or a shake replacement. And then we're expected to just hold on to that diet and manage. And that is where this framework has fallen short. Because when we do that, when the nutrition industry, when the wellness industry, like strength coaches and health coaches and all these well-intentioned people tell their clients, you just have to have more discipline. Let your family eat the pizza, but you better stick to those macros. That's where we get into trouble because we're forgetting, the wellness industry accidentally forgot that human beings have a brain attached to the body. And brains have a lot of experiences that we won't go into depth today. I wish we could, but I'll just say this. Your body has a budget and your body budget gets taxed by things that are stressful, things that are straining, things that might give you more negative affect. And what happens in our brain is our brain starts mapping out ways to deal with those negative experiences and those taxes. And our brain will find ways to reward itself or cope with a low body budget, often with food. And there's many reasons for that. One of them is that we learn it from primary caregivers when we're growing up. It's the norm and it's in our food culture. I mean, even things like if you get straight A's, you get taken to McDonald's. If you don't have any cavities, you get an ice cream. If you score a goal, we'll go out for pizza. This begins really, really early on. I've never had a client almost that doesn't have some of that in their background. So I just want you to keep that in play as well. How we treat food in this food culture is products to go, feeding opportunities, diets, and the absence of respect for how a nervous system works and how a brain works. And what we can compare that to, and this is my personal bias, I like to think of natural systems and evolutionary biology, because I'm fascinated by, well, how are we designed? Because here's how I think of my clients. If I take a polar bear and I put him into the rainforest, and then I say, what's with this polar bear? He can't figure it out. Is something wrong with the polar bear, or is he in the wrong environment? And that's how I view our food relationships, because when we look at our evolution, it is clear that we're designed for something different than what we're in right now. For starters, we are deeply social creatures, and how we learn about food and share food and interact with food is very, very communal. And now we often are eating dinners and meals at TVs, scrolling Instagram, working through lunch, eating alone. And we are creatures that do well and thrive with a food culture. Like we know from around the globe, for example, that there's rich food cultures on every continent, but some of the famous ones are parts of Asia, like Japan and Okinawa. We also know the Mediterranean and regions along that coast have these deeply social food cultures where there's a lot of food sharing. There's food wisdom, generational wisdom. There's recipes. There's a very gentle relationship with nutrition where it's connected. So there's a true food culture that's serving the members of that community. And we have undoubtedly evolved to require that. We also have this really interesting thing that I think sometimes gets forgotten as well here, which is that when we are eating with others and socializing with others, our nervous systems get to co-regulate with one another. And this actually comes up a lot in my client sessions. And it so clearly came up in client sessions many years ago that it became a passion of mine to dive into this science, which is to look at how does my body feel and how safe do I feel at my own dinner table? For example, if I had a client who would hide food and run into the closet when they were little because their parents were screaming at each other during their divorce, does that nervous system, that child's nervous system, have the opportunity to co-regulate with people and caregivers around them that they feel safe with? And then blood can enter the GI tract and they can relax and enjoy the meal, taste the meal, feel their body, stop when they're full, and leave the table peacefully. Many of us don't have those types of food experiences. Not only is that just not even normal for our food culture, but it's not unusual to have some things in our background that really intercepted the development of a healthy food relationship. The other thing that we can't forget is we are designed to eat certain types of foods. And when we eat certain types of foods, our body is actually pretty darn good at knowing what to do with them. And some things occur that we often call nutrient sensing is one of them, which is that my appetite regulatory processes can do a really good job regulating how much food I need or when I'm full or when I'm hungry, when it can communicate a little bit more thoroughly and effectively with the food. When I eat foods that my body is not very much used to or evolved to consume, like Chunky Monkey from Ben and Jerry's, there certainly wasn't a Chunky Monkey tree in the wild. And when we look at our nutrient sensing abilities, those modern foods kind of circumvent and sneak around our nutrient sensing abilities. So when we eat these foods that we're not designed to eat, we also don't really know when we're full. It can also then impact the other end, which is we're not great at determining when we're hungry. And that also can throw off a lot of feeding behavior. So when we look at what we're designed for, We know that we need to eat foods that our body can communicate with and sense and regulate. And we also know that we need to have the opportunity to co-regulate with others at meal times. And we need to have food culture, sharing, and understanding with food. And all of that culminates in our food behavior, which basically allows the system to regulate itself. Now, when I look at my average client, there's often a background of binging, dieting, restricting. Parents were dieting. Food was talked about at the table in a very negative manner. The other day, a client mentioned to me, my dad always said, oh, of course it's good because that's what'll kill you. And he always joked that he only likes the foods that were going to kill him. And then her mom was always dieting. So food just becomes totally confusing. We don't understand really how to have a relationship with it. All the good stuff that's so delicious and pleasurable is also the stuff I'm not supposed to eat, but we all want to eat it. So we're all still having it anyways, but very stressed about it. Other clients often have stories like, I wasn't allowed to leave the table till I cleared my plate. So then from an early age, we're also learning not to honor fullness cues. And then other clients often have a background where all food was brought to the house. There was a lot of takeout or fast food or to-go food. No one really cooked at home. So there was an absence of food culture. And then they become adults that say to me, I'm so uncomfortable in the kitchen. I don't even know where to begin. I had a client even say, I don't know how to chop herbs. Like she felt stupid asking, but she said, rosemary looks like a pine tree. I don't know how to, do you just like put the whole stick in? Like, do you chop that up? And she was laughing, but actually it's a really good question. If you've never seen how to do that, you wouldn't know how. So these mismatches are really important for us to consider. And the reason I take the time to go through this, today I'm going through it quickly, but I can, even in painstaking detail at times, I go through this with people because I have never had a client say to me, I don't know why, I just don't have more discipline. And this to me is a major gene environment mismatch. It's not just issues of willpower. And here's just a really good example. I'm just going to give us one study today, just because it was so fantastic. This study was done at the National Institutes of Health, and it was conducted by Kevin Hall. He's one of the lead researchers there. He's fantastic. And he did this study in a metabolic ward, which we don't get a lot of these in nutrition. So this is always nice when we get one of these. It's very expensive. So we often aren't allowed to lock people up in chambers and study their feeding behavior and metabolism for a month, but this is one of them. And basically what they did is they presented participants in the study two different diets. One was ultra processed and one was unprocessed. But the food presented on each tray was the same amount of calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients. And they wanted to see, how do people eat? When everything is even, what happens to ultra processed food intake versus whole food intake? And what they found was intake for the ultra processed food was 500 calories per day more than the non-processed foods. So both trays had 2,000 calories on them, but when people ate the unprocessed foods, they got full and they stopped eating. So say they ended up eating 500 calories at the meal. The ultra processed food tray also had 2,000 calories on it, but people weren't getting full and they ate 1,000 calories of food. So that's what we call ad libitum intake. So just without trying, calories increase in the ultra processed diet, and body weight changes were directly correlated with diet differences in energy intake. And we might think to ourselves, maybe that seems obvious, but actually it's really good to get data on this, because this is something that we want to think about. And it's been something that we've looked at in nutrition science to say, well, if calories are all equal, can we kind of eat anything and everything as long as we control things or measure things, or do all foods fit? That is actually something we need to ask and we need to examine. This study found that if left uncontrolled, processed food intake definitely equals more calories consumed. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying we have processes for regulating food, like nutrient sensing. Then we know when we're full, we know when we're hungry. We can feel our body more. Our body can talk to our brain and let us know, oh, I'm getting full down here. We're doing good. When we're eating these ultra processed foods, we're seeing that communication is intercepted. It just doesn't work quite the same way. We can take in a lot more food because we're eating foods that we're not designed to regulate. So what can we do? All of this is to say, I think there's a lot of very, very good reasons why handling our nutrition in this strange modern food environment is so hard. So the framework we're establishing here is being clear about what the hurdles really are and how that alters our behavior, which fortunately then means that can help us figure out, okay, well, what can I do? Because me trying to get you to be more disciplined, and then when we meet next week, you finally say, oh, I did the homework, Erin, doesn't work. And my years of working with clients has shown that thus far. So years ago, I set out on a quest of, we've got to have a new model here because this whole thing isn't even working. I remember saying to a client, we often think about on the wagon, off the wagon. And I remember saying, you know what? There's no wagon anymore. I'm done with this wagon. This wagon is broken and it doesn't work. So let's build something new. And where I like to begin is to think about what makes a human do anything that they do. And one of the things that we know from behavioral psychology, we talk to our friends over in psychology when we get into this type of science, is that environment drives behavior. And this is why I believe nutrition is not just a food science, it's a biopsychosocial science. And I feel strongly that that is a more accurate framework for looking at food and assessing food, and even looking at where our body is at right now. We must understand where my body is at, where your body is at right now is not just the result of food. It is the result of a biopsychosocial interaction. Sure, many biological interactions, and for sure food interactions, and that's all biochemistry, but also psychological and social interactions. And those streams are feeding the river that is you. And that's why we care so much about environment, because we know that environment drives behavior. And my favorite way to sum this up briefly is with what we call the over-attribution error. And I like this little graphic depicting it, which is this little stick figure saying, sorry, I'm late, there was traffic. And his boss is saying, you are flawed as a human. That is a fundamental over-attribution error, which is to say, I am going, and this is what we do with food. We say everything that you have eaten and everything that you're doing is because of you just wanted to do that. So if this little stick figure guy was late to work, is it because he wanted to be? Is he flawed? Or did he hit traffic, darn it. Happens to the best of us, right? The same thing happens with food. And my quick example for that is, let's say I'm at a nutrition conference and I'm traveling out of state. I'm at my hotel, I'm running late, there was no food in the morning. All I had is coffee, and I busted into the conference late and I had no time to eat. And they also didn't offer anything for lunch and I didn't bring anything. And by the end of the day, it's 6 p.m., for example, and let's say they bring out pizzas to all conference attendees and Erin has a slice of pizza. Did Erin have a slice of pizza because she really wanted a slice of pizza? Or did Erin have a slice of pizza because she was starving, underfed, hangry, probably, right? That was all that was available, out of time. You can see there was environmental cues and a drive in that environment to having the pizza. That would be an over-attribution error to say Erin ate pizza because Erin just wants pizza. And she is not disciplined. And she is the cause of this. And we have to take that into consideration with food, because who we live with, what's in the kitchen, what's at home, and all the important things I mentioned before, like what's in our whole food environment, all the food cues, all the norms, all the advertisements, all the products, they're cueing us all the time. So this is not to say, oh, there's nothing we can do. It's more so to say, let's identify where we can do something about this, which means I need to modify my food environment and then develop skills to learn how to navigate this very challenging food environment. So it actually leads us to the opportunity of developing skills to handle it. And that is where a lot of opportunity sits. And one way we can think of this too is to kind of think of it more in like a daily term. I like to focus on building my clients' food culture for themselves. So sure, food culture can be big. Food culture can also be small. And something that you could start thinking about today for reframing your nutrition is to think, what's in my environment? What's serving me? What's not serving me? What affects my food intake? But then how can I create a food culture for me that serves my goals, nourishes me, and helps me make the decisions I really want to make? And reframing that into building your food culture is a wonderful first goal. And then, as I mentioned before, problem number 2 is what we're eating. So one way to think of this is, as I showed in that study, the ultra-processed foods, those are what we call hedonic eating opportunities. Hedonic means pleasurable. Homeostatic eating is all the natural foods, those whole foods that my body's really good at regulating. And we want to be aware of our food culture is steeped in these hedonic eating opportunities that my body has a really hard time regulating. And I'm going to focus on filling my food environment with homeostatic eating strategies like whole foods. And there's much more that we can talk about here with hormones and things like that, but I'll stop there. But I just want you to leave with a lot of these foods are hedonic and they're hyper palatable. And that actually really affects my body. And it definitely activates a lot of pleasure-seeking centers in the brain. So we also just want to be aware of that so that we can think about how can I adjust things in my food environment to soften that. And then what we can do, and I'll stop here. I'll control myself, but basically we really want to learn how to eat. So what we can do is focus on things like movement and creating a new food story for ourselves, paying attention to where we might be using food as reward or stress, or when we're ashamed. We want to use foods that help us regulate our body's appetite. And we want to become oriented and understand where we are, how we're using food, and how we could use it differently. So the mission for shifting our nutrition goes from, I need to find the right diet and I just need to be more disciplined. And we reframe that with, I'm going to focus on learning how to eat and creating a food culture for myself that really serves my health and what I want in life. And I will stop there.
Well, that was wonderful. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Erin. What a whirlwind. I mean, I love the public health data that you provided us with, because that's so interesting for us to all think about as we're thinking about our own health, just kind of how the guidelines kind of became what they are. Mm-hmm. And I think there's so many interesting aspects to what you said that we could really spend hours talking about.
That's the hard part, literally hours, yeah. Right?
Literally, yes. So, I think, the big questions that you are posing to us, right, to think about are what habits really support our nutrition, mm-hmm. What habits, and how do we build in those habits so that we're not just kind of a slave to the environment, right? Because we know if we don't have a support system, the default is having that pizza because we're all on the go, right? And then how do we actually get started with putting these pieces together, right? Because I think it is really complicated. So maybe you could just give us a 1 minute on how you guide people in this journey.
Absolutely. So let's see if I actually I might have a graphic for that. So one thing, I'll actually go back to sharing my screen because this might help. I do have a slide on this. One thing that I like to think about for phase one, for really learning how to eat and rewriting our food relationship, is to just start by assessing our food story. My favorite way to think about this is actually a Carl Jung quote, which is until you bring the subconscious to the conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And with a lot of our nutrition, we're on autopilot. It's all we know. The relationship and the framework that we have right now is often all we've ever known. And the only way to start shifting that is actually to first become conscious of it. So we really want to think about, what is my food background? How do I talk about food and use food? And then there might be reasons for that. Did I have a parent who was always doing that? Do I kind of have this mindset with food that you're either on the wagon or you're off the wagon? We have to start bringing awareness to our food relationship. And then what we can think about is rewiring those habits one at a time. Because habits, even though they seem like cement, they're very plastic. So it is a matter of working through things slowly. So what we have to do is become aware, and then very gently, one at a time, working through automated behaviors. So for an example, what we might say is, I'm noticing every day when I come home, I walk right into the kitchen and I open up the cookie jar. What we want to look at is, and this is a very real client story, so many of these, I've had clients say, I still have my coat on and I'm like in the cookie jar. I just walk right to it. We need to first figure out, we need to become aware that we're doing that, for starters. And then we can say, what is driving me towards this? And for many clients, something, for example, might be, I'm having trouble coming down from being so activated all day at work. And what I actually need to do is do a headspace meditation for 5 minutes in my car before I drive home. Or I need to plan a walk for right when I get home. And then I need to have something yummy and nourishing for dinner that I'm excited about. And we start shifting all these little moments throughout the day. And when you do that for a while and string them together, you have a completely new day. So thankfully, they're very, very plastic.
That's, wonderful. And I feel like I've been having so many discussions in the pandemic about self-medicating, because I think all of us, on top of kind of what we've grown up with, are maybe approaching food in different ways too, just because our lives are different now, right? And how are we coping with this? And how have maybe our processes have changed a little bit, or our stress levels are up and we're coping with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I joke about food. Food is wonderful. I love food and I love to eat, but there's a lot of problems that food cannot solve. And it's a lot like bringing a hammer to cut down a tree. Food is fantastic, but it can't improve our marriage, for example. So we don't want to misuse food. So a really big task often in my client work is detecting the differences between emotional hunger and physical hunger, and learning how to cope with what we really need so that food isn't improperly used to solve something that it can't solve.
Perfect. This is so important, Erin. I love your approach to stepping back and not be like, I need to cut back on carbs. I need to, XYZ, but you just want to reframe how you approach food. There's a question in the chat from our nurse practitioner, Jonathan, who says, what is your personal go-to strategy for when patients or clients are doing their best to surround themselves with healthy choices, but their family is not necessarily on board?
Good question. And I frame this in two ways with people, because this is really common. This is definitely a big one. And what we might say first is, I kind of zoom out with my client and we'll say, okay, the food environment I'm in, is there any chance of the environment changing in terms of, is my family eating foods that maybe also aren't good for them? And we actually do want to change this environment, because if we want to do that, you're going to become an influencer. And we're going to figure out how to make that happen so that the client's healthy and nourishing food culture that they're building actually starts getting built for the whole home. And I really work through that with clients often. That can be a really big one. Option 2 is if the client says there is no chance of this food environment changing, no one is interested. We might have to come up with ways for how that specifically is showing up for them. If it's that there's really unhealthy foods in the pantry that the kids keep buying, we need to kind of intercept their habit of doing a lap to the pantry. And we might have things in the fridge for them, or we might find that they need to have, one of my clients right now is in the middle of having, she makes a Mediterranean snack plate. And it's like this cool little bento box, and she has it in the fridge, and she knows I don't need to do my pantry lap because I have this thing over here for me. So what we'll do if we can't change the environment is get really, really sneaky about each one of those food opportunities and how to just very quickly shift them all. So we're really doing more habit change in that setting. And also understanding that's a high friction environment. And if my client says there's no chance of the environment changing, that's okay. But we have to acknowledge, okay, I'm just feeling this friction because I'm in a high friction environment, and getting good at dealing with that.
Nice.
That's such a wonderful approach. I love that so much. I talk with my patients a lot about using food as medicine, right? And so I have the luxury, I feel like, of making really specific and targeted, right, options or suggestions for patients, right? But then they're kind of left with exactly what you're explaining, the complexities, right, of all their baggage, their home life, right? And how you put that into play, right? So it's not as simple as saying, I'd like you to eat an unprocessed diet that's, full of potassium and magnesium that's going to help your blood pressure come down, right? Well, how do we put that into action?
Right. It's the implementation that is just where you just have to become a ninja at implementation, essentially. There's a lot of tricks to that for sure.
Yeah, no, that's where your experience comes in, and having tried and failed and then tried and succeeded, because you've probably heard it all, right? Everyone's got a barrier. Everyone's got an excuse. Everyone's got a reason why they can't follow this Mediterranean diet that we keep talking about, because it's hard. The real world is actually so hard. We're getting close to the end, but there's a question here about snacking culture and any suggestions for how to find substitutes for salty snacks from someone who grew up with a dad in the food business. And before you start, I just want to say real quick, because we were talking before the webinar started, the three of us, about salt versus processed food. And salt itself really isn't the enemy. It's the hyper processed food that's packed with salt and is really, really low in nutrients, low in potassium, low in magnesium. Those are the ones that raise risk and are really the ones we want to avoid. The pretzels, the chips, the French fries, the junk food, the processed food. But salt itself, you may be craving salt because it might be something your body needs. We all need a certain amount of salt to get through the day. But do you have any suggestions for people who crave those salty foods, healthy ways to satisfy that craving?
Definitely. So there's a few things you can do there. One is you could shift into a healthier salty snack, like some lightly salted almonds, or like some nuts or things like that. Or you also can explore a little bit with your palate. So if someone loves, like if you're more of a savory eater, it could be really fun to experiment with certainly nuts and seeds with a little salt on them, but also shifting into things like some really nice olives and hummus with veggie sticks, or even, I love this trick because I love getting people a dose of fermented foods every day. There's some really good brands of sauerkraut. There's one in particular called Farmhouse Culture Dill Pickle Sauerkraut. And I'll have my clients mash a little tuna with hummus and dill pickle sauerkraut and scoop it with cucumbers and celery. And it's so flavorful, but it's so filling that you get this really big savory experience, but you're packing more nutrients in there. So play Tetris a little bit, see how much nutrition you can pack in there. And then just really quickly, part 2 to that would be, don't remove a ritual right away. So I love replacements and swaps and shifting things rather than full quick removal to the person asking that, because I think they said, any suggestions on how to do this with less stress. It would be really stressful to your brain if all of a sudden you said, can't have a snack anymore. And that's where the swaps can be so helpful and just really slow the habit down and then gently shift it.
Nice. That's great. Great advice.
Well, this was so fun. Gosh, I mean, I feel like we are just poised for part 2, Erin, with maybe coming up with, the top 10 practical ways, right, to implement this. But
absolutely.
I just want to thank you for your time today, and thank everybody for joining us. When we send the post-webinar survey, we'll give Erin's contact information because she is wonderful to work with, and she is accepting new patients. So for anybody interested in that, I can vouch how successful she is with her clients. And then for everyone else, stay tuned for our next webinar, hopefully in March. And we definitely have a lineup for the spring that's going to be wonderful. So we'll include that in the next email as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.